Welcome, everybody, to the first edition of Classics 240 Greek and Roman Drama Distance Learning Format. This is Professor Smay, of course. And today we're going to be talking about the playwright Euripides and the first half of the first of his plays that we're going to be looking at, Medea. So we got to begin by introducing Euripides, our new playwright. He's an interesting character. To start off with his biography, he's roughly contemporary with the last playwright whom we read, Sophocles. He's born a little bit later than Sophocles, we think, and dies a couple of years earlier. Apart from that, we know very little about him. Almost nothing of his biography has been preserved. One of the few tidbits that we do get is that in his own lifetime, he wasn't very successful as a playwright. You may recall that the production of plays in Athens were in the context of a competition, right? At these religious festivals, a number of playwrights would put on their plays, and then there would be judging of them, and prizes would be awarded for first, second, and third place. The last play we read, Sophocles, was wildly successful in that. He was the most decorated playwright of the 5th century. He won more first-place prizes than anybody else, including the great Aeschylus. Euripides, by contrast, was not terribly successful. He had a couple of plays that won first place, but he wasn't very much appreciated in his own time. After his death, however, he was rediscovered, so to speak, and became one of the great three, along with Aeschylus and Sophocles. And in fact, Aristotle, in his Poetics, which we talked about in a previous lecture, gave Euripides the exalted title of the most tragic of poets. So he came eventually to be very much appreciated, even if his contemporaries didn't quite realize his genius. We are going to read 3 of his plays, and he makes an interesting contrast with the previous 2 playwrights we've read in a couple of different respects. First of all, his approach to myth is different than that we find in Aeschylus and Sophocles. For the Greeks, the world of mythology was in some ways similar to the way that modern Jews or Christians or Muslims imagine the world of biblical times. That is to say, it was believed to be real, but it was a world that operated according to different rules. It was a world full of larger-than-life characters. It was a world in which humans and gods interacted in very direct and personal ways. It was a world where the miraculous was a common occurrence, and where people behaved in ways that were more heroic, more epic than people in more recent times did. Those earlier playwrights, Aeschylus and Sophocles, tended to portray that world very literally. That is to say, they portrayed it in its own terms, right? It was depicted on the stage in precisely that sort of otherworldly way that a contemporary audience would have expected. Euripides, by contrast, takes a more ironic, in some ways more subversive approach to the treatment of myth. He retells the stories, right, and uses the characters, but in a sense removes them from that set of otherworldly assumptions. He places his characters in a very contemporary, very modern context. Modern, of course, from the perspective of 5th century Athens, without any of the kind of special assumptions that went into the Greek understanding of what the world of myth was like, and surrounds the primary characters with people who are very ordinary in their outlook, and allows those ordinary people to reflect on the behavior of the mythological heroes from a very contemporary, very modern perspective. And indeed, even ascribes to some of the principal characters ideas that are very much part of his own 5th century BC world, not really appropriate to that world of myth with its whole set of assumptions. We'll flesh out that idea as we read through the stories, read through the plays, and that'll hopefully make more sense once we've had a chance to see how that works in practice. He also takes more liberties with the stories than Sophocles or Aeschylus did. To be sure, Aeschylus and Sophocles did occasionally take a degree of poetic license with their stories and add details that were not part of the canonical myth, but they were generally conservative in the way that they treated those tales. Euripides is much bolder in changing the traditional stories, and we'll see an example of that with our very first play, Medea, where he takes the traditional tale and gives it a very, very powerful twist that really changes the meaning and sense of the story. The other aspect of Euripides that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is his interest in a modern phenomenon, again, modern from the 5th century BC perspective, called sophistry. Sophistry was the school of thought practiced by a group of people called sophists. The sophists were public intellectuals, but also people who offered their services for hire as teachers. That is to say, they would go around and offer to teach people the wisdom that they knew. I use the term wisdom because the term sophist derives from the Greek word sophos, which means wisdom, or sophia, which means wisdom. In any event, they offered to share their learning for a fee to anybody who wanted to pay. They were the first professional teachers, if you will. And what they taught particularly was the art of rhetoric. They taught other things as well, but rhetoric was the real bread and butter of their teaching. And they were particularly successful in Athens, the city from which our plays come. Why were they so successful in Athens? Well, you recall that Athens was a democracy. And in the radical democracy of Athens in the 5th century, any citizen could stand up and argue for or against proposed legislation, or even introduce a law, him or himself, and ask his fellow citizens to vote on it. And so persuasion was enormously important if you wanted to be a political mover and shaker. Anybody who had that capacity to persuade could potentially make himself a man of real importance in the Athenian state and direct its political fortunes. Also, Athens was, perhaps even more than modern America, a very, very litigious society, meaning that lawsuits were an enormously important part of its public life. Anybody could bring a lawsuit against anybody else. There was no professional police, no public prosecutors. So anybody could charge another fellow citizen with a crime. And whoever does the charging would have to go in and make the case himself. And likewise, the person charged, the defendant, would have to go in and defend himself in court, right, giving their own speeches, interviewing their own witnesses, and so on. And so the ability in a situation like that to be persuasive, to have a knack for rhetoric, could be a matter of life and death for even an ordinary Athenian citizen. And so the services of the sophists as teachers of rhetoric were very, very much in demand in the 5th century in Athens. One of the claims that the sophists made by way of trying to drum up business was that they could argue either side of a case and win it. That was a useful bit of advertising, of course, because your ability to win a court case didn't necessarily have to depend on having the right on your side, right? If you had this capacity to persuade, you could win the case regardless. But the amorality of that suggestion was deeply troubling to thoughtful people in 5th century Athens. If a sophist could win either side of a case, that implied that they could win the worse side, right? They could be successful even on the side of injustice, in other words. And that was something that was deeply, deeply troubling to a number of people, such as the great philosopher Plato, who railed against the sophists as monsters of immorality. And it interested Euripides also, right? That there was a dangerous fascination with that capacity to persuade. And so a number of his plays, including all three that we're going to read today, feature characters who are essentially sophists, people who use rhetoric in manipulative ways to control those around them. And, at least in the case of Medea, perhaps even to persuade themselves that right is wrong and wrong is right. So in all three plays, we'll examine the commentary that Euripides provides on this intriguing but perhaps dangerous new science of rhetoric being peddled by the sophists in 5th century Athens. The play Medea describes one episode in a very, very large, expansive collection of stories that commonly goes by the name of Jason and the Argonauts. And understanding what's going on in the play depends on having at least a passing familiarity with that story. So let me briefly give you a bit of background information on the Jason and the Argonauts story, Medea's place in it, and on the genealogy of Jason and Medea by way of introduction before we jump into the play proper. We could easily spend the whole hour and 15 minutes just telling the Jason and the Argonaut story. I would want to move on to the play quickly, so we're not going to do that, of course. In the sort of narrowest compass, smallest nutshell we can manage, the story goes something like this. Jason is the son of the rightful king of a kingdom of Greece, but the throne is usurped by his uncle, who then banishes Jason for fear that Jason will try to come back and reclaim his throne or avenge the abuse done to his father. Jason goes and lives in the wild, and then, once he reaches manhood, returns to the kingdom ruled by his angry and jealous uncle, and is recognized by that uncle, who now decides that he needs to get rid of him. So he tricks Jason into undertaking what seems to be an impossible quest, to go to the ends of the earth, as the Greeks understood it, and to fetch the fleece of a golden ram, a kind of a family heirloom, which, for reasons we don't have time to go into, has been deposited in a faraway kingdom called Colchis. Jason manages then to gather around him a kind of a who's who of the Greek heroes of his generation, including names like the great Heracles, whom you might know by the Latin or Roman name Hercules, and to set off in quest for this golden fleece upon a ship called the Argo, which, because it had been made from the wood of trees of a sacred grove, was sentient and could speak. So Jason and his companions, who are called the Argonauts, set off on this adventure. They have a wide variety of exciting adventures that were favorites in the Greek storytelling repertoire. We don't have time to go into them all by any means. But after various adventures or misadventures, comes to this distant kingdom called Colchis. When he gets to Colchis, he asks the local king if he might have the golden fleece. The king of that distant land is reluctant to give it up, and so sets for Jason a series of impossible tasks. He must yoke a fire-breathing bull, plow a field with it, or actually a pair of bulls, plow a field using these bulls, and then sow the field with the teeth of a dragon, from which spring fully formed armed men whom he must then defeat. And then, having done that, he has to somehow get past a dragon which is guarding this golden fleece. He surely would have failed had it not been for the fact that the king had a daughter named Medea. Medea falls in love with Jason, oftentimes through the agency of the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. And because Medea is a sort of sorceress or magician, she is able to help Jason achieve these impossible tasks. Her particular specialty is the mixing of potions and poisons and things of that sort. And by means of that, she's able to assist Jason in getting this golden fleece. Having done that, the local king then tries to prevent Jason's return to Greece with the fleece, and he has to flee with Medea, and also Medea's young brother in tow. So Jason and the Argonauts, together with Medea and this brother of hers, set off in the Argo, but they're pursued by the fleet of the angry local king. And in order to throw off the pursuit, Medea has to come up with a strategy. She decides, in the first of a series of murders, to take her younger brother and chop him up into little bits and scatter the bits in the wake of the Argo. Her father feels compelled to pause in his pursuit to pick up all the little bits of his son, and that pause allows Jason, Medea, and the Argonauts to escape the king's pursuit. And they eventually come back to that kingdom of which Jason now is the rightful ruler, but is still governed by the usurper, his uncle, a man named Peleus. What to do? Jason has fulfilled the quest that was set for him, but Peleus is still very nervous and reluctant around him. Once again, it's Medea who comes to the rescue and finds a way to dispose of Peleus. She, using her magical powers, puts on a display in the palace. She takes an elderly ram, cuts the ram up into bits, puts it into a cauldron, stews it up with some magical ingredients, and from the cauldron leaps a sprightly young lamb. She then says to the daughters of Peleus, "I can do the same for your father. If you will chop your father up, I will put him in the cauldron, add in the certain magical reagents, and he will emerge from the cauldron rejuvenated." The daughters of Peleus accept this. They come to their father in his sleep and chop him up. Medea puts the pieces into the stew, but leaves out the secret ingredient. And so rather than a rejuvenated Peleus coming from the pot, there is nothing but Peleus stew. The hope was that would regain for Jason his kingdom. But unfortunately, the locals are enraged that their king has been killed by such a subterfuge, and Jason and Medea are forced to flee again. They now come to the land of Corinth and ask to be allowed to take refuge there, and their request is granted by the king of Corinth, a man named Creon, whom we'll meet in the course of the play. So, when Euripides' play opens, Jason and Medea are in Corinth. This is the point where Euripides' version goes in a different direction from the traditional myth. The standard version, before Euripides wrote this play, which was the version that we know was current in Corinth because there was a religious ritual associated with it, went like this. Jason decides to leave Medea and marry the daughter of the Corinthian king. Right? Her name is Glauce. Medea, in a rage, kills the princess Glauce and her father Creon, and then flees. The Corinthians are so enraged that Medea has murdered their king and the princess that they then avenge themselves by killing Medea's children. And in fact, every year the Corinthians celebrated a religious ritual where they tried to expiate the guilt of having murdered Medea's children by having a sort of a ceremony in their honor and offering sacrifices to the spirits of the dead children. As we'll see as we get into Medea, Euripides changes that story radically. and the fate of the children is different in a very crucial way. Hold that thought for a moment. We'll talk about how that works once we actually get into the play. So, that's the background story. A little bit ought to be said, however, about the genealogy of our two principal characters also. The reason is that in Greek myth, storylines tend to run in families. That is to say, people who are closely related will have very, very similar stories, right? Their stories will be variations on some theme. We've already seen a little bit of that when we read the Oresteia and noticed that the entire story of the House of Atreus was the story of what happens when the principle of revenge consumes a family. And there were other recurring themes, incest, cannibalism, and so on. That's also true of the stories of Jason and Medea. And in fact, if you know something about the genealogies of those two characters, you can almost guess what it is that Euripides does with this story, because the tale is, in a sense, a continuation of the family histories of Jason and Medea, respectively. Again, there's a lot of mythology here, and we don't have time to go into a lot of it. But to just give you a taste, Jason's family is full of people who harm, or at least attempt to harm, their children. He's related as a cousin, for example, to two important figures in myth named Athamas and Ino, both of whom kill their own children. And he's even more closely related to another mythological figure named Tyro, who doesn't manage to kill her own children but tries her best and is only prevented by circumstances. Medea is from a family full of women who destroy the men in their lives. One of her aunts is a figure by the name of Circe. If you've read the Odyssey, you almost certainly remember her. She was the witch who lived alone on an island, and whenever mariners washed up on her shores, she lured them into her house and then used her magic to turn them into animals. Another aunt was named Pasiphae. You may not know her name, although you may know the name of her husband, Minos, who's a very important figure in myth. Minos was serially unfaithful to Pasiphae, and Pasiphae got her revenge by cursing Minos, so that whenever he had sexual relations, he would ejaculate snakes and scorpions and spiders, which would then sting his lovers to death. She also had two cousins, Phaedra and Ariadne, whose stories play in some sense into this motif. Phaedra we're going to run into when we read our next Euripides play, Hippolytus. So I'll just give you a very brief preview of her. She fell in love with her stepson, Hippolytus, and tried to seduce him. When he rebuffed her advances, she committed suicide and left behind a suicide note in which she claimed that Hippolytus had raped her, causing Hippolytus' father to destroy him. Ariadne, another cousin, was loved by the Greek Athenian hero Theseus, and very much like Medea helped Jason, Ariadne helped Theseus only to be abandoned by him. She didn't get revenge in the way that Medea did. The stories differ in that respect, but another parallel in the sense that these two cousins are both lovers of heroes who were then abandoned by them. Don't worry too much about Ariadne, by the way. She goes on to marry the god Dionysus, and then has it pretty good. So Medea's character, Medea's genealogy is full of women who are wronged in some way by their husbands, and in most cases, Ariadne being the exception, get some revenge upon them, or who are sorcerers in some sense. Both Pasiphae and Circe are witchy types of women who are possessed of supernatural powers. And that puts Medea into a category that I've labeled here as the bad girls of Greek myth. There's a a sense in Greek religious thought that women, because of their powers of procreation, have access, all women, to a kind of magic. And a consistent theme that runs through a lot of Greek mythology is the anxiety that women might use this magic to do harm to men. There are a whole series of stories about women with magical powers who are femme fatales, who are dangerous in some sense. The Amazons are maybe the most famous of these. These are warrior women who live on the edge of the world. And every Greek hero worth his salt has to have his battle with the Amazons, in which he overcomes them by some combination of violence and sex. So in any event, Medea falls into this group of dangerous women or bad girls, and that's an important aspect also in understanding what's going on in the story here. All right, so with that, let's actually start reading the play. As always, in the plays we've looked at so far and the plays we'll look at in the future, there's a character who comes on in the beginning to offer an opening monologue that sets the stage in various ways. Oftentimes in the past, that character has been someone who then disappears from the story, but the nurse who does the opening monologue in Medea winds up becoming an important character throughout much of the first half of the play, at least, and even to some degree later on. So she comes out and offers an opening monologue, which does the things that opening monologues always have to do. The first bit, beginning from line 1 and running down to about line 15, gives just enough of the background detail to remind an audience in Athens that was already very familiar with the Jason and the Argonaut story about some of the key details. And in particular, in this case, what Medea has done for Jason's sake in helping him get the Golden Fleece, to destroy Peleus, etc. Having reminded the audience of those things, we then come to the laying out of the central problem of the play. We've said that in the past too, right? Every play has to have some problem that requires a resolution of some sort. In this case, the problem is that Jason has decided to abandon Medea. So he has arranged a marriage with the princess, Glauce, the princess of Corinth, and so he has now decided to abandon Medea and leave her alone in this foreign land to which he's brought her. That problem will get worse, we'll see in a moment, but that sort of sets the stage in that sense. And then lastly, as these opening monologues usually do, there is some indication of the primary theme or themes of the play, right? Something that tells us what is been going on beneath the surface, if you will, in the story. That bit begins on about line 36, where the nurse says she hates her children and feels no joy in seeing them. I am afraid that she may be planning something we do not expect. Her temperament is dangerous and will not tolerate bad treatment. That beginning line, of course, is ominous. She hates her children. On one level, it's obviously an overstatement. We'll see later that Medea still does have tender feelings towards her children. But there's some truth in it also, right? The mere sight of her children reminds her of her unfaithful husband. And so her motherly affection is mingled with a kind of a hatred. And also, and this is going to be the real point of the play, Medea's temperament is raised, right? And her inability to tolerate being bested, being beaten by anybody. That's going to be a crucial idea. So as the play proceeds, pay careful attention to her motivations, why she does what she does. Because Medea is at root essentially a psychological play. Right? It's about the evolving psychology of Medea herself and watching the way that she reasons her way to what she ultimately chooses to do. More on that in a moment. Once the opening monologue is over, we have the introduction of a second character. A tutor comes on. In ancient Greece, the high and mighty, generally speaking, didn't raise their own children. They had slaves who did that job for them. And so the tutor is the slave whose job it is to educate the older children, whereas the nurse's job is to take care of the much younger children. They have a back and forth on pages 2 and 3 of our text, if you have our class edition, in which it's revealed that Medea's situation is even worse than she had originally thought. Not only is she divorced and abandoned by her husband, but now she is also exiled from Corinth. The king has decided that, especially because now she has a grievance against him and his daughter, that she is too dangerous to be left in the city. And so she is very shortly going to be apprised of the fact that she has to get out of town. The nurse and the tutor commiserate with her. They both feel sorry for her situation. And it's worth noting, they, and later on the chorus too, condemn Jason. Jason is clearly in the wrong. Look at line 82, for example, on page 3. The nurse says, "Oh, children, do you hear how your father is behaving towards you? Curse him. But no, he is my master. Yet he stands plainly convicted of being a traitor to his friends." At the beginning of the play, the minor characters, the chorus included, are very, very much on Medea's side. Right? It seems the common opinion of the characters from whom we ought to get our sense of how to regard the situation, that Medea has a legitimate grievance, and that Jason is doing something indefensible. Even if the tutor is a cynical man. Note that, continuing where I left off on page 3, about halfway, he responds to the nurse by saying, "But is anyone different? Are you only now realizing that everyone loves himself more than his neighbor, some justifiably, others simply to improve their situation, seeing that their children no longer loves these children because of his new marriage?" The tutor represents a point of view here that Jason himself is going to take up, an argument from expediency, right? That says that everybody is sort of a cynical, selfish person underneath all of the sort of the exterior front that they show to the world, and that everyone is ultimately out for themselves, and that's simply the way of the world. Hold on to that thought also. That bit over, Medea now is heard for the first time. According to our editor, probably not on stage immediately, but rather conducting a conversation where she's still behind that facade, and the nurse and the chorus are out on stage. Be that as it may, Medea is mostly lamenting her fate in sort of wild, irrational tones. That repeated "ay" that you see for the first time on page 4, line 111, is a traditional woman's wail, probably carried out at length, right? Yeah, or something like that, and meant to express extreme emotion, extreme despair, the kind of thing that women would do at funerals, for example. She's already been introduced by the nurse as a character of wild passions, dangerously wild passions. And this opening scene highlights that fact, right? Her despair is not moderated at all. She calls upon the gods to strike her down. She hates life and so on. The reaction of both the nurse and the chorus to that is something we've already run into before, a typical mix of a call for moderation and a kind of choral humility. The nurse, for example, on page 4, if you look at lines 119 and following, says, "Our royal masters have dangerous spirits, and perhaps because they are subject to little control while their power is great, their moods veer violently. To accustom oneself to live on equal terms with others is preferable. For my part, as long as my old age is secure, I shall be happy, if it is far from greatness. For myself, I say the name of moderation has a better ring than that of greatness. and in experience it proves by far the best for men, while excess brings no profits to mortals. And when the god has grown angry with the house, it pays the penalty of greater ruin. Remember that we've heard this before, usually from the chorus, not from one of the spoken characters. Here the nurse has taken on part of that choral role of expressing the point of view of the humble common citizen, right? Or perhaps that of the Athenian audience, looking at what the high and mighty do, their violent passions, their wild excesses, and saying to herself or themselves, don't let that be me, right? Keep me far away from the wild excesses of those who are powerful. That same moderation is echoed by the chorus on page 5. If you look at lines 154 and following. Will you hurry on to death's finality? The chorus asks Medea. Do not pray for that. If your husband is solemnizing his new marriage, do not be cut with anger at him for that. Zeus will be your advocate here. Do not wear yourself down so much in these laments for the partner of your bed. In other words, moderate your grief. The gods look after us and will avenge our wrongs, right? Don't go to extremes. The other noteworthy thing about this section that we're talking about now is that it introduces a motif that runs through the rest of the play. And that is Medea as being something less than human. In particular, she's connected again and again and again with imagery of animals. Medea is metaphorically made an animal, if you will, in the course of the play. Look, for example, on page 6 at lines 187 and following. 186 and following. The nurse chants, yet she darts on her servants the wild glance of a lioness with young. As you read through, keep an eye out for other moments where Medea is likened to an animal, right? An unreasoning brute governed by passions. It's an important motif in the play, and we'll talk about exactly how that works a little bit later on. Once the chorus does its chant that takes up the bottom part of page 6 and the top of page 7, Medea, according to our editor, then emerges from behind the facade and comes out on stage to deliver what could be treated as her opening monologue. It's a masterpiece of sophistic rhetoric in a way. Sophists always emphasized that you had to, first of all, win over the sympathy of your audience. The emotion that you try to engender is what the Greeks call pathos. That is to say, a sense of sympathy or sort of fellow feeling in an audience. And Medea does a good job of that. She begins by addressing the women of Corinth in line about 215 or so, and plays upon the fact that she is an alien. That is to say, she's not only not from Corinth, she's not even Greek. And that puts her at a tremendous disadvantage, right? That not only does she not know the ways of the place in which she's living, right, isn't used to the culture, but also has no friends where she is, right? No family to fall back on. She is utterly alone in the world. She says that, she does her best to do these things, but together with the calamity which has struck her, being abandoned by her husband, being so utterly alone in the world, that she's operating under a horrible disadvantage. From there, beginning at line 230, she passes on to the sufferings and miseries of women. It's a classic passage, and thought to broadly speaking, represent some of the importunities that real ancient Greek women operated under. She emphasizes, for example, the fact that a husband had to be essentially purchased with a large dowry. And that once that had been done, the woman became a sort of a pseudo-slave, right? She had very little power within the marriage, at least formal power. right? The husband, as she puts it, becomes a master of the wife's body, amongst other things. Um, and from there, the wife becomes wholly dependent upon the husband. If the husband is a good and decent human being and happy within the marriage, then the woman's life is good, perhaps even enviable. But if the husband is cruel, mean, or unhappy in the marriage for whatever reason, then the wife suffers and she has no real means of helping herself. Also, women's lives, she points out, beginning on about line 245, revolve entirely around family. And so if family life is wretched, then the woman has no escape from it. She's not, generally speaking, allowed out of the house. Unlike her husband, who is able to escape from an unhappy domestic situation, find satisfaction in other things, and in particular, pursue other romances. She also points out that while men oftentimes play up the fact that women don't have to go out and fight in wars, and in real historical Greece, most Greek city-states were almost constantly at war, so warfare was a real danger. But she points out that women had their own form of danger in childbirth, and that childbirth was in fact perhaps more dangerous than going into battle. It's a list of complaints that is broadly true for women in general, but it should be pointed out, a lot of this does not really apply to Medea herself. She made a love marriage, right? Even if that love has gone sour since then. She didn't buy her husband with a dowry the way that most women did. Nor is she nearly as powerless as a typical Greek woman would be, right? Although perhaps in a formal sense, she was subject to her husband as a sorceress or a magician. She clearly has agency and power that most Greek women don't have. In any event, she then, in a crucial move, says that she intends to take revenge upon her husband and upon the king and his daughter. And she swears the chorus to silence. The chorus agrees. Look at line 260. Medea says, "If I can find some means, some scheme to take a just revenge for these evils on my husband and the man who gave his daughter to him, and that daughter whom he married, I ask you to keep silence." And a few lines later, the chorus responds and says, "I shall do what you ask, since you will be right to exact vengeance from your husband, Medea. I do not wonder that you grieve over what has happened." So the chorus accepts the principle of revenge. That was a typical Greek way of thinking, right? That if someone does you wrong, you have the right, almost the obligation, to avenge yourself. And Medea has said that her vengeance will be exacted upon her husband, and her husband's new wife, and the wife's father, the king, who has arranged all of this. Those will be the targets. And the chorus has agreed to say nothing of what they know of her plans. That promise to keep silent is going to be important later, so bear that in mind. And note also that the chorus still broadly approves of Medea, right? Their judgment of the situation is that Medea is in the right, and that Jason and Creon and Glauce are the ones who are in the wrong. Keeping track of what the chorus thinks is always important, because it's a good gauge of what the audience is supposed to be thinking. Right, so we'll keep careful track of that as we move through the play. So with that, then about the middle of page 8, line 271 and following, the king, Creon, enters. By the way, it should be pointed out, this is not the same Creon that we met in Oedipus the King and Antigone. Creon is simply a title in Greek. It is a title given to kings, right? It means ruler or something like that. And so in Greek myth, there are any number of Creons. So this Creon is very different from the Creon from Thebes, whom we saw in those plays by Sophocles. Different person entirely. In any event, Creon comes on now to formally deliver his decree that Medea is to be banished, and to be banished immediately. She must leave that very day, or her life is forfeit. Creon's reasons are plausible, right? She is a known murderess. She is a known sorceress. And so her presence can't be tolerated, right? She's known to be a vengeful woman. She has the means to seek vengeance. She has motive to harm him and his daughter and his new son-in-law. And so, on very plausible grounds, he wants her out. Medea offers a defense, up at the top of page 9, line 292 and following. And again, she's very much the sophist, right? Very much the clever manipulator. Sophists, as I said before, always emphasize you have to win the audience's sympathy in some way, to represent yourself as being pitiable in some sense. And Medea is very cunning in that regard. Look at what she says. Alas, alas, not now, for the first time, but often, Creon, my reputation has harmed me and done me great damage. Any man who is sensible should not have his children taught to be clever beyond the norm. For beside the indolence they get a name for, they also foment bitter animosity from the citizens. If you present stupid people with a wisdom that is new, you will strike them as useless and idiotic. Then again, if you are considered superior to those who think they are subtly clever, you will be thought offensive in the city. I myself do not escape this ill feeling. I am clever, and so to some I am a butt for their odium. To others I seem wrapped up in myself. To others, quite the opposite. And then again, to others I appear antisocial. But I am not excessively clever. So she says, look, it's all the result of being intelligent, right? Being knowledgeable, being capable. That's the way she represents her sorcery. And says that it's a terrible burden to be clever in that way, because you wind up coming in for all kinds of unjust suspicion. That's a clever response, a clever reproach, right? I mean, a clever response, I should say. Right? It's not my fault I'm intelligent, not my fault I'm clever, and all sorts of opprobrium attaches to me because of that. And what comes next is, again, very clever rhetoric, although deeply disingenuous. And so you fear me, she says. This is now lines 307 and following. What harsh evil are you afraid of? You may suffer at my, sorry, what harsh evil are you afraid you may suffer at my hands? But it is not my way. Have no fear of me, Creon, to offend a royal family. After all, how have you wronged me? You gave your daughter to the man whom your heart directed you. It is my husband that I hate. In my opinion, you were sensible to do what you did. And now I do not grudge it if I do not grudge it you that fortune smiles. Let the marriage proceed, and good luck go with you all. But allow me to live in this land. Wronged I may be, but I am mastered by a stronger power, and shall hold my peace. She's just said that she's not going to take her revenge upon Creon or his daughter. Right? She has no resentment of them. She only resents her husband, and even then, she won't take any revenge upon him, since she has to bow to the power of a more powerful man, that is to say, to Creon. We know from what she's just told the chorus, back on page 8, that isn't true. But it's plausible sounding, and Creon doesn't know what she said. In the back and forth that follows, Medea gradually wins Creon over. And crucially, Creon reveals his weakness, right? Reveals how he can be hurt. At the top of page 10, this is now line 328, Medea says, "Oh, fatherland, how intensely I recall you now." That is to say, casting her mind back to the kingdom she grew up in Colchis and wishing she were back there. Creon replies and says, "I understand. My children apart, I love my country far above else." There's an element of foreshadowing in this, right? The way to get to Creon is by attacking his children, whom he loves above all else, right? His child in particular, Glauce the princess, whom Jason has agreed to marry. Medea now engages in a very typical Greek gesture. This is called, what comes next, a supplication. She throws herself at Creon's feet, as suggested in the image here on the PowerPoint slide, taken from a modern production of the play Medea. She throws herself at his feet, grasps his knees, and reaches up with a hand and touches his chin. A supplication is a moment in which one person puts themselves in the power of somebody else, admits their inferiority, their lack of power, and asks for the protection of a more powerful individual. That's what Medea is doing here when she begs him for a favor. And this gesture, this supplication, is symbolically very powerful in Greece. It's very difficult for a Greek in a position of authority to reject a supplication because of the implicit subjugation of the person doing the supplicating, right? The acknowledged inferiority, so to speak, of the person doing the supplicating. What does Medea ask? She asks for another day. An eminently reasonable request, it might seem, right? Give me just one day to set my affairs in order, to make preparations, and then I will go into exile. And very much against his judgment, Creon agrees. He gives her that extra day. He knows that he shouldn't. If you look at line 349 on page 10, he says, I am far from tyrannical by temperament, and by showing mercy I have often come to grief. And now, too, I can see that I am making a mistake, woman. But, nevertheless, you will have what you ask for. That's the fatal mistake, right? Because it's all that Medea needs. It's a single day to set her plans in motion. Medea's sophistry has worked. She has cunningly manipulated Creon into giving her everything she needs to get her revenge. Medea then sets out to plot her revenge, and having taken the chorus into her confidence, the chorus, and therefore we the audience, are now privy to what she has in mind. She has many ways she could actually kill the king and his daughter, and her husband too. At this point of the story, she's still talking about killing her husband. If you look at line 377, she says explicitly she means to kill him as well. Poisons, but other means as well, swords, many things could work. The trick is how to take revenge and survive, right? She would need to flee Corinth, of course. The Corinthian population would never stand for the murder of their king and princess. But where can she take refuge? What place would have her? As we'll see soon, the answer to her problem arrives in the form of the king of Athens, but more on that in a moment. There are a couple of important mythological figures who are mentioned in the course of this long monologue that takes up most of page 11 and the top part of page 12. One is Hecate, who appears on the very bottom line on page 11. That would be about line, 196. Hecate is an underworld deity, a goddess of magic and death, who also happens to be an ancestress of Medea herself. That's what that reference is about. The other reference of interest appears on page 12, line, 405, in the person of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is the founder of Corinth, and a notorious master of cunning and subterfuge. He's most famous as a figure of the underworld who is eternally punished by having to roll a boulder uphill. He never manages to make it. The boulder always rolls down to the bottom of the hill, and he has to start the process over again. If a task is ever referred to as Sisyphean, what that means is that a task can never be completed successfully. He's in the underworld because he cheated death. When he was about to die, he tricked death himself, Thanatos in Greek, into coming to the world above, and then imprisoned death, tied him up literally, so that he couldn't die. And several days went by, and nobody could die because death was in prison. Eventually, the fact that people were being beheaded and stabbed and so forth, and yet not dying, was becoming a problem. the god of war, Ares, thought in particular that this was kind of an intrusion upon his domain, and so death was released, and Sisyphus had to go down to the underworld. Anyhow, mentions this because she herself has that kind of cunning, right? There's a sort of an appropriateness to this, but also because Sisyphus has this connection to the local place. Here she is at the end of that speech, emboldened in herself. She has to sort of work herself up to this, and that's going to be a recurring theme of the play also. Line 408 and following, she says, "You have the skill. And what is more, we are women, supremely helpless when there's good to be done, supreme in clever craftsmanship of all bad deeds." Apart from the sort of strangely misogynistic tone of that, which in a sense reverses the earlier sympathetic treatment of women that we saw. I point this out because this is the first of many instances where Medea has to use her rhetoric upon herself, has to sort of work herself up to a state where she can commit the act that she's going to commit by the end of the play. All right, well, the chorus responds to that and reflects upon the role of women and tries to offer a defense to the characterization of women that Medea has just suggested, right? That women are useless when there's good to be done, but full of cunning when there is evil to be done. Yes, they admit there have been women in the past who have done bad things, and they mention a few cases of tricky women. But they say also that men have much to answer for also. And perhaps we're meant to understand that Jason is a man who has a great deal to answer for here as well. All right, so with that, Jason now comes in. We're on page 13 now, roughly line 445. And he gives his opening monologue, which fills up about the middle of page 13. What comes next, not just the monologue, but the whole back and forth between Jason and Medea, is that portion of a Greek play which is oftentimes referred to as the agon. That's a Greek word that means a contest, oftentimes an athletic contest, but it also has a courtroom sense to it. The agon is the moment in the speech where the accuser and the accused directly confront one another and sort of debate the merits of the case in a courtroom. When it's applied to drama, it means the moment in the speech when two characters confront each other and debate the central moral or ethical issue of the play. We've already seen a couple of moments like that in previous plays. This is the most obvious agon here in this particular tragedy, because the two principal characters, Jason and Medea, are now going to confront one another and argue about the merits of Jason's decision to divorce Medea and marry the princess. So we can treat this very much as a courtroom trial, with Medea functioning as the prosecution and Jason acting in his own defense. Jason comes on and, as Medea had done, tries to win the sympathy of an audience. In this case, tries to win Medea's sympathy himself. He claims that he has no ill will towards her, will try to help her in any way that she can, and is really only doing this for the benefit of their family, right? Their children will be better off after he makes this royal match, because he will have a connection with the ruling family of Corinth. Medea, needless to say, is not buying it. And her speech of prosecution, which begins on line 465 and continues on to page 14, makes several charges against Jason. The first is that in divorcing her, he is acting with the basest kind of ingratitude. She recalls all of the things she's done for him, from helping him get the golden fleece in the first place, to helping him and the Argonauts escape afterwards, to helping him dispatch that uncle of his, Peleus, by having his daughters cut him up and put him in the broth. And says that given all of those services, that Jason really should stick with her, right? Appreciate everything that she's done. From there, she moves on to the charge of oath-breaking. She claims that they have conducted a marriage ceremony, right? And having conducted a marriage ceremony, which involves an exchange of oaths, that he is now bound to her by his sacred word. And in divorcing her, he is breaking his oath. A little bit of commentary probably should be introduced here by way of explaining that in ancient Athens, a marriage between a Greek and a non-Greek, a barbarian to use the Greek word, would have no legal standing whatsoever. Although this isn't set in Athens and is set in the kind of historic or mythological heroic past, nonetheless, I think that there's a kind of a contemporary resonance here. From Jason's point of view as a Greek, no marriage with a barbarian can ever really be binding. Whereas from Medea's perspective, the marriage is formal, fully valid, and so his unilateral divorcing of her represents a breaking of those oaths. So there's that, and then there's simply the charge of cruelty, right? Here she is, alone in a foreign land with children. How can he possibly leave her all alone in a situation like that? She ends her long tirade against Jason down on the bottom of page 14 with an interesting line that's worth reading. This is line about 516 or so. "O Zeus," she says, "why have you given men clear ways to recognize what gold is counterfeit, but on the body put no stamp by which one should distinguish a bad man?" That is to say, there were ways in ancient Greece to determine when gold had been diluted with base metals, right? You could test it in various ways and figure out that it had been alloyed. But there was no similar way to look at a human being and tell if their souls were good or bad. That's a recurring theme in Euripides also. We're going to run into that very explicitly in Electra and somewhat more elusively in Hippolytus. So keep that idea in mind also. He's very much interested in how you can tell what someone's character is, right? What indications do they give of their soul within? So that's Medea's speech of prosecution. It's then Jason's turn to respond on page 15, lines 522 and following. To the charge that he's being ungrateful, he answers that in reality, it wasn't her decision to do all those services for him, right? It was the goddess Aphrodite who forced her to fall in love with him. And it's to Aphrodite that Jason owes a debt of thanks, right? Medea had no volition in the matter, no choice, right? Carried away by passion. She was simply compelled to go and do all those services, and therefore he doesn't really owe her that debt of gratitude that she imagines that he does. It's a debate that turns on the Greek conception of what love really is, and it's very different from ours. So again, it's worth pausing to talk about. For I think most modern people, 21st century Americans at least, love is something that comes from within, right? It's an expression of something which is deeply part of ourselves. Greeks, oftentimes at least, didn't think of it that way. For them, love was something that came on you from the outside. It was something foreign that intruded into your psychology and took you over. It was even a kind of a madness, a kind of insanity. And that all was represented by the role of Aphrodite or by her son Eros, who is sometimes represented as being the kind of the mischievous youth, the child who shoots arrows that cause people to fall in love. But in any event, love is something external that comes in and takes you over by a kind of an enthusiasmos, a little bit like the kind of thing that happens when the god Apollo, as god of prophecy, comes and inhabits his prophetess, takes her over and then speaks through her. Aphrodite does something similar, coming in and inhabiting somebody and making them do things that would normally be considered insane. So that's the conception of love that Jason appeals to when he makes this charge. It may seem outrageous from our point of view, but it would have made a kind of sense from the perspective of ancient Greeks, because they thought of love in that way. He then goes on and responds to her arguments about cruelty by reference to arguments for expediency. That is to say, he says, look, what I'm doing is something which, from the point of view of cold rationality, makes sense. Right? This is in the best interest of our family. Yes, it may be something that stirs up emotions of abandonment or jealousy or something like that, but from the perspective of what is best for our children particularly, this is something that has to happen, right? This makes sense. And then describes Medea as responding simply to intense sexual jealousy. She is a woman who is upset because her place in her husband's marriage bed has been taken by somebody else. And it's caused her to respond irrationally to what is, in fact, a very sensible arrangement on his part. Right? And if she could just master her passions, master that sense of jealousy, then she would come around to his point of view and see that this is really all for the best and makes good sense. And appeal to a particularly kind of misogynistic attitude, right? A belief that women are less capable of reason than men are, more prone to respond emotionally, when a more level-headed response would be better. And in a typically sort of misogynistic vein that we're going to see again when we come to Hippolytus, he says on page 16, line 573 and following, the human race should produce children from some other source, and a female sex should not exist. Then mankind would be free from every evil. We'll hear those words echoed by Hippolytus himself in very similar language, so hold that thought. The response of the chorus is interesting in this moment, right? They're still very much on Medea's side. Read what comes next after those lines I just quoted. Jason, what you have said is superficially convincing, but nonetheless, even if I shall speak against what you think, you seem to me to be acting unjustly and betraying your wife. Jason here is represented too as a sophist, like Medea, right? Someone who is capable of making wrong seem right, making a superficially convincing argument, although one that the chorus sees through. Well, the two go back and forth, taunting one another for the rest of page 16 and on to page 17. And then we get another choral ode. The chorus comes back to themes we've seen before, talking about the need for moderation, for example, at the top of page 18, exhibiting that typical choral humility that we've met so many times before. And then goes on about the middle of page 18 to talk about the dread of exile. This is something, again, that I think you have to sort of put yourself in the place of an ancient Greek to fully understand. Modern Americans are notoriously mobile, right? We very oftentimes go to college or find work far from the places we grew up. We don't have that sort of dread of losing our community that ancient Greeks would have had. Most ancient Greeks are born, live, and die all within about 10 miles of the place that they were born. And their sense of identity is very much wrapped up in that community, right? The city-state or the village in which they grow up. And so for them, exile holds tremendous terror, right? To be driven out is something almost too frightening to contemplate. And although Medea is, in a sense, already in exile, since she's living in a land not her own, nonetheless, here in Corinth, at least, she had some kind of place because of her connection to Jason. And now to be driven out on her own as a single woman in charge of two young children is something truly horrifying. And the chorus reminds the audience of the terror that situation holds here in the latter half of that choral ode. In the last bit that we're going to read for today, we're introduced to the character of Aegeus, who is a mythological king of Athens. We don't have time to go over his mythology in great detail. He's the father of the great Athenian hero Theseus, and the man for whom the Aegean Sea is named, but we'll have to skip over that story, interesting as it is. Medea is introduced here for a very particular reason. Medea had been perplexed by the problem of where to go and what to do after having taken her revenge on the king, his daughter, and her husband Jason. What land would take her in? Where could she find refuge? Aegeus's appearance now in Corinth is enormously opportune from her perspective, because it offers her the chance to arrange for a safe exile after having committed her murders. And so in her interview with Aegeus, which follows the section we just finished, we see again Medea as a master manipulator. She says to him that she is going to be driven out of Corinth, but doesn't mention her plans to commit murder, and asks Aegeus for protection. And Aegeus is tricked into offering it, right? He feels sorry for her in her predicament, is won over by the pathos that she's able to create in him, right? That sense of sympathy that she is so good at engendering, and makes her the offer of exile, and even swears a mighty oath by the gods to protect her from anyone who may seek to do her harm. He can't, because he's currently the guest of Creon, king of Corinth. He cannot offer her any assistance in Corinth itself. But if she can get to his shores, arrive at his land, he will protect her from anyone who may mean to do her harm. And with that, Medea has the last piece of the puzzle, right? She has everything she needs now to carry out her act of revenge. Aegeus heads off, and Medea once again addresses the Corinth. We've now skipped ahead to page 21, near the bottom of that page. And now she lays out her plans. She's going to kill Creon and Glauce, although it seems now that Jason is no longer on her list. She does not mean to kill him. Rather, she has a fate worse than death in store for him. She's going to get an even more horrific kind of revenge on him, and now reveals how she means to do that. This is a key moment. This is line 790 on page 22. But that is enough of that, she says. I cry out when I think what kind of deed I must do afterwards. For I shall kill the children, my own ones. Nobody is going to take them away from me. My heart steel to the unholiest of deeds. I shall wreak havoc on the whole house of Jason, and leave the land in flight from the charge of murder, the bloody murder of my own children. This was her revenge, right? She's going to leave Jason destitute and force him to live out his life without a wife, without any children of his own. A miserable existence. The question of motive now becomes important. I told you to pay careful attention to the way that Medea explains to herself why she's going to do this. She's already, in the passage I quoted, offered one rationale, right? Nobody is going to take them away from me. She seems to think that the children are going to be taken from her. Perhaps when she flees, she can't bring them with her or something like that. And she's unwilling to have the children in anyone's possession but her own. So she would rather they die. So that's one. What comes next, continuing on from the place that I broke off, line 797, is perhaps even more to the point, however. She says, laughter from my enemies is not to be endured, my friends. Come what may come. What do I have to gain by living? I have no fatherland, no house, no refuge from calamity. It was then that I made my mistake, when I left my father's house, persuaded by the words of a Greek man, who with God's help will pay me the penalty. He will never see his sons born of me alive again, and he will have no son by his newly-wed bride, since that wretched creature must die a wretched death from my germs. Let no one think of me as weak and submissive, a cipher, but a woman of a very different kind, dangerous to my enemies and good to my friends. Such people's lives win the greatest renown. This is her real reason for doing what she does. Partially revenge on Jason. That's a crucial element of it, right? This is the best way she has to hurt him. But above all, because she cannot be beaten. She cannot endure being laughed at by her enemies, right? Her pride simply does not permit that. She has to win. And she has to be seen by all as being powerful, not to be trifled with, right? Dangerous to her enemies. The reaction of the chorus here is crucial, right? Up to now, they have supported her entirely. Now, however, the chorus begins to turn against her. Keep watching, right? As time goes on, the chorus is going to be becoming increasingly condemning of Medea as she gets closer and closer to carrying out the fatal deed itself. But remember, the chorus has been sworn to silence, right? Back when Medea had said that she was going to kill only the king and the princess and her husband, they had agreed to say nothing of whatever plan she might make. And now, even though the plan has changed and she means to kill her children, the chorus is held to that promise that they had made. The other crucial point here is the role of Athens. Now, we've mentioned before that Athens oftentimes is injected by the playwrights into myths that are basically about other places, right? The way that, for example, Aeschylus tells the story of Orestes. It's Athens where the crisis in the house of Atreus is resolved, right? Where the horrible primordial justice of feud and revenge is converted into something better by Athens' patron deity, Athena. And similarly, Athens plays a role in the story of Oedipus, although we didn't read the play when that happens. That's the middle play, the Oedipus and Colonus play we didn't look at. Well, Athens has now been injected into the story of Medea also by the playwright Euripides, but in a way which is much more problematic. The role of Athens in the Oresteia, for instance, is overwhelmingly positive. But here, Athens' role is deeply troubling. Athens is going to be the place of refuge for the most horrendous kind of murderess, right? This monster who murders her own children for the sake of getting revenge upon her husband. And so, in a typically Euripidean mood, which is subversive and ironic and so forth, that great tradition of manipulating myths to give Athens its exalted place is reproduced, but in a way that is much more troubling to an Athenian audience, right? Much more problematic. And lastly, and then I'll let you go, there is also the introduction of another motif, another important set of symbols at the very end of the choral ode that takes up most of page 23 and the top of page 24. The very last lines of that choral ode read like this: "When your boys fall in supplication, you will not be able to wet your hand in their blood with unflinching heart." The chorus still believes that Medea is not going to actually carry this out, which is why they are still to some degree on her side, although beginning to lose their confidence in her. Later on, when it becomes clear she is going to do this, the chorus condemns her. But the motif of the hand is going to be very important. It's going to be her hand with which she murders the children. She's going to stab them with a dagger. And so the hand covered in blood, the hand wielding the dagger, becomes an image which recurs constantly in the back half of the play. Keep out for that. Keep an eye out for that as you read along also. All right, so we'll stop there. We'll pick up next time after with the return of Jason to the scene on page 24, line roughly 866 and following. If you have questions about any of this, I'm going to set up a discussion board on iLearn. You're welcome to go in and post comments there. That would be ideal, actually, because other people can then go and see what you've said and see my responses, and that will help everybody understand what's going on here. There'll be participation credit given for that. So particularly if you've been quiet in the course up to now and were a little bit shy in the in-person class, this is a great way to get yourself some participation points. Look for that discussion board. And then remember also that there is going to be a quiz you'll need to take set up on iLearn. And I'll send you an email with details on the start time and so forth on that. All right. Thank you very much. Do get in touch with me if you have any questions. Post something on that discussion board, and we'll hopefully be able to get a discussion going about this. All right? Take care.